Hey, my name is Claudette Brady, and I'm Executive Director of Save Harlem Now. Welcome to the final part in our series, The Road to Harlem, the Forgotten History of Black Manhattan, the Rise and Fall of San Juan Hill. We would like to begin by acknowledging that the land we inhabit is the ancestral home of the Lenape and other indigenous people who have stewarded this land for generations. We honor their ongoing connection to this land, and we pay our respects to elders past and present. A little about Save Harlem Now. Save Harlem Now was founded in 2015 to address the lack of historic designation and to preserve properties in Harlem. Save Harlem Now advocates for the designation of individual landmarks and historic districts in Harlem, for contextual zoning in Harlem, and educates the public about Harlem's built heritage, history, and culture. This program and others that we provide for freely to the public are funded through donations from people like you. So please take a moment, click on the QR code, and send us a donation so we can continue to bring you vital programs about Harlem history and Black history in New York City and America. The series of program was in partnership with the Merchants House Museum, Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation, Black in Historic Preservation, and Landmark West, who will be presenting tonight. Inspiration from this program came from three sources: Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation, successful designation of the Jacob Day House in the village, Professor Erica C. Avrani and Kennedy with Wider's Spring 2025 studio at Columbia University in search of Black Bohemia, reparative preservation in Manhattan's Tenderloin. The studio is part of a series of preservation studios developed by Professor Avrami that focus on cultural heritage preservation, specifically the Black experience in Manhattan. And lastly, James Weldon Johnson's book, Black Manhattan. I'd like to introduce Sean Corsandi, Executive Director of Landmark West.
Thank you so much, Claudette, and thank you for having us tonight. We really appreciate all the work Save Harlem Now and our partners have done in this series. Landmark West is especially proud to be a part of it. And we hope to hear from all of you who are in attendance, whether it's in the chat or during our Q&A following the presentation. For those of you who may not know us, Landmark West is a 40-year-old preservation and land use organization serving the Upper West Side from 59th Street to 110th Street and from Scenic Landmark Riverside Park through Scenic Landmark Central Park. We engage in extensive education outreach, diverse programming, and wide-ranging research and preservation advocacy to continue to protect and celebrate our unique historic environment. Our work on San Juan Hill launched in 2022. And tonight we welcome you to the Road to Harlem, the Rise and Fall of San Juan Hill. On this journey, we will be led by our speaker, Jessica Larson. Jessie is an art and architectural historian currently based in LA. Her work examines the social relationships formed and fractured by the built environment, how race, gender, and class mediate questions of poverty and labor, and how prejudice and benevolence are inscribed into architectural form. Her dissertation, which completed her PhD in Art and Architectural History at the CUNY Graduate Center in 2024, analyzes the architecture of charitable and reform institutions designed and built in Manhattan for Black aid recipients between the Civil War and World War I, with a specific focus on how women directed these spatial programs. Her scholarship and research has been supported by fellowships from the Smithsonian Institution, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Library of Congress, the New York Public Library, and others. For Landmark West, her name is familiar. Jessie continues to delve into specific site histories of the former buildings in San Juan Hill, which can all be found on our website in our San Juan Hill portal. Previously, she's also presented Holding the Safety Net in San Juan Hill and NYCHA's Amsterdam Houses Before and After, both available on our website. We are pleased to have the support of Councilmember Gail Brewer and the Cultural Immigrant Initiative to bring Jessie back once more for the fourth installment of The Road to Harlem. A warm welcome back, Jessie.
Hi, thank you so much, Sean, and thank you so much, Claudette. I'm trying to share my screen. Okay, great. All right, thank you so much for joining me today for this latest and the last installment in the Road to Harlem series. We're going to examine the neighborhood of San Juan Hill in Manhattan's Upper West Side. From about 1900 to 1915, San Juan Hill was the center of Black life and culture in Manhattan, and it's often considered a sort of precursor to Harlem, where residents would migrate next after about 1915. Before looking at San Juan Hill when it was really in full swing, I'm going to give a brief history of the area before its dense development, as well as an overview of the place of Black New Yorkers prior to its popularity, in case viewers didn't tune into the first couple of installments of this series. A crucial context that I always like to remind people of is that you really can't look at San Juan Hill without also keeping in mind the precedents that led to it, not to mention the fact that the prominence of San Juan Hill comes only 45 years after the end of Southern slavery in 1865. And at the first lecture on Lower Manhattan, as the first lecture on Lower Manhattan explored, New York State technically had slavery until 1827. However, it's kind of more complicated. There was a gradual manumission process that had begun in 1799, and by the time 1827 comes around, there were comparatively few enslaved people in the state. But still, by the time San Juan Hill becomes more densely populated around 1900, the majority of Black residents of the city had been touched by slavery in some form or another, whether it was themselves, their parents, or their grandparents. During and just following the Civil War, the majority of Manhattan's Black population lived in this area indicated here of Greenwich Village called Little Africa. Many of these residents had lived in New York since before the state officially outlawed slavery in 1827, but after the Civil War, the population's numbers swelled through migrations from formerly enslaved people moving north. There was also a small but very active population of Afro-Latino immigrants who had escaped political upheaval in Cuba and Puerto Rico, but heavy immigration from the Caribbean wouldn't really be in full swing until the early 20th century. I'm sure many here are familiar with Seneca Village, the Black settlement that had existed in what is now Central Park. It's speculated that some of Seneca Village's residents relocated to Little Africa, but this is also, it's been a really hard thing for historians to trace. So it's speculated, but we're not positive. With increasing immigration from Southern Europe in the 1870s and 1880s, most of the area's Black residents were pushed uptown, where many settled in an area called the Tenderloin District. Historians have claimed that two events led to widespread Black migration to San Juan Hill in 1900 from the Tenderloin District. Those two are the beginning of the construction of Penn Station and the 1900 Tenderloin race riot, wherein white residents and police attacked Black Tenderloiners in mass and destroyed Black homes and businesses. There's certainly truth to this. It did certainly catalyze a lot of migration northward. But if we look at the census, we can see that there was already a pretty sizable Black population in San Juan Hill by 1900. As an example, this is just a snippet from the census from 1900 for addresses on West 63rd Street. We can see that a Black family was living side by side with a white family almost universally throughout Manhattan, as was also true of Little Africa and the Tenderloin. If a building had Black tenants, it would exclusively have Black tenants. White renters would, in almost all cases, refuse to share a building with Black tenants. So you might have one building that's entirely Black next to a building that is entirely white, which is exactly what you see here on the census. I know it's a little hard to read. 19th century handwriting is not simple. But one certainly untrue rumor from the time claimed that Black residents began to move into San Juan Hill after a landlord opened tenancy to Black renters to spite white tenants that he had a disagreement with. That's almost certainly not a true statement, but it kind of gives you an insight into the sort of rumors about migration that happened at the time. We can look at a 10-year span of how the portion of the neighborhood physically changed. What we're looking at here is called a fire insurance map, sometimes called a Sanborn map after the company that popularized them. Beginning in the mid-19th century, insurance companies began producing these extremely intricate maps of cities to essentially assess their liability. If you aren't sure what you're looking at here, you're essentially looking at a bird's eye view of the outlines of these buildings or their footprints. On this map from 1897, we can see that the area is becoming more densely developed, although there are still a good number of empty lots, more than you would likely find on a block in, say, downtown Manhattan. There are also a number of wood frame buildings, which is what those yellow little squares are. In 1866, all new wood construction in Manhattan was banned, so we know that these aren't new developments. San Juan Hill was frequently slandered as being comprised of dilapidated wooden shanties and outdated hazardous tenements. We can see some of that going on here. All of these buildings in pink here have no air shafts, which was a design aspect outlawed for multifamily homes in 1867. So these buildings are either row houses intended for single families, or they're rather dated multifamily construction. So this is all to say that in 1900, this area is pretty industrial, relatively undeveloped, and one of the few areas left in the city where Black residents could expect to afford to live because the housing wasn't exactly great quality. Also, with the opening of the elevated L train, the last stop of which was 59th Street and 9th Avenue, it was far easier for San Juan Hills residents to commute to jobs downtown. If we then skip ahead to this map from 1907, which shows roughly the same area, we can see that it is more built up, and while you can't see it on this map, a number of the lots shown here are empty, had just been purchased and were about to be developed into large tenement buildings. We can also see in this image how changes in tenement design and legal regulation played out. In red here is an example of something called an old law tenement, which was a tenement whose design was regulated by an 1879 law that resulted in something called a dumbbell design, named because the design of the air shaft looks like a dumbbell, if you can kind of picture that there. These were generally considered fire traps and incubators of disease. However, in 1901, new legislation passed, which is often called the New Law, which significantly regulated tenement design and curbed developer and landlord exploitation of tenants. It also meant that it was harder for developers to build over single lots and instead had to build over multiple lots, which we see here in blue. Some of the most prominent architects of the day took an interest in designing new law tenements, seeing an opportunity to produce structures that enhance the lives of the city's low-income tenants. I'll return to a few examples of these sites in San Juan Hill a bit later, but point being that while San Juan Hill was largely regarded as a slum, somewhere with completely crumbling infrastructure, the reality was more complex. There were many beautiful new commercial and residential buildings, but ultimately tenants had little leverage when it came to convincing landlords to maintain the buildings. Black tenants suffered the worst housing conditions in the city, regardless of socioeconomic status. The reformer Jacob Riis wrote, quote, "Once a colored house, always a colored house," end quote, meaning that if a building was occupied by Black tenants, white ones would forever refuse to rent or live in the tenement. This de facto segregation pushed Black tenants into dense, cramped housing in areas like San Juan Hill with few avenues for recourse against exploitative landlords. Well into the 20th century, once San Juan Hill was in full swing, the area was notoriously loud and filled with fumes and smog. In 1902, construction began on the Interborough Rapid Transit Company powerhouse, or the IRT powerhouse, between 58th Street, 59th Street, West End Avenue, and 12th Avenue. Designed by the famous architect Stanford White, who also designed such structures as the Arch in Washington Square Park or the Boston Public Library, the massive station powered the city's original subway lines. This was part of the City Beautiful movement, which was an architectural and reform philosophy that espoused the idea that if city residents' surroundings were grander and more beautiful, they would in turn become more productive members of society. The station, which at one point produced more electricity than any other plant in the world, was loud. Reportedly, you could hear the turbines for blocks surrounding the station, and the coal dust that billowed from its smokestacks was constantly hanging in the air and filling residents' lungs. The train was also notoriously dangerous, with numerous instances of derailing and crashing into surrounding buildings. So at the turn of the century, San Juan Hill was not the most desired place to live. The housing was old, outdated, and dangerous, and the environment was loud and unhealthy. In fact, the area was so notoriously polluted and unhealthy in 1901 that the city made plans to construct one of the first municipal bathhouses in the area. Built on West 60th Street between Amsterdam and West End Avenues, this bathhouse was intended to alleviate the horrible conditions caused in part by the IRT powerhouse. Also, according to one newspaper, the intention was to serve Black patrons of the neighborhood, though seemingly antagonisms between San Juan Hill's Black and white adolescents, mostly Irish and Italian, although some Jewish, led to the site being a place of racial tension and de facto segregation. The bathhouse opened in 1906 and featured, for the first time in the city, a plunge, or as we call it today, just a swimming pool. This large pool could fit about 250 swimmers and offered women only swimming 3 days a week. While this swimming pool was pretty novel at the time, it eventually became the main attraction as apartments became legally required to provide bathing facilities to tenants, and they didn't need to go to somewhere like a bathhouse to get clean. And if you want, just so you know, you can still go to this bathhouse. It is still open and run by the New York City Parks Department. But still in 1900, the area, while not densely populated, was still pretty heavily white. The Black population was rising, however, and some blocks were already essentially entirely Black, such as West 63rd and West 64th Streets between West End and Amsterdam Avenues, and increasingly so towards Columbus Avenue. Most Black residents were migrants from the South, though there were also residents who had immigrated from the West Indies beginning then. After Southern slavery was abolished in 1865, formerly enslaved people began migrating to the North to escape emerging Jim Crow laws and find better opportunities. This was not as significant of a shift as the later Great Migration, but between about 1865 and 1900, the Black population of New York did double, which is a substantial increase. As was documented over and over in accounts by these migrants, many were met with bitter disappointment when they arrived in New York, finding not the landscape of equality that they had hoped for, but to some even more dire racial conditions, exacerbated by things like poor housing, immensely siloed work opportunities, and police violence. We can pull out one example to get an idea of the people who lived in San Juan Hill in 1900 and what their lives might have been like. What I'm showing you here is the entry for 235 West 62nd Street from the 1900 federal census. 8 families lived in the building with 30 tenants in total, all of whom were Black. Many came from southern states like Virginia and the Carolinas, while others are listed as from the British and Danish West Indies, meaning places like Jamaica or Antigua. While certainly not always the case, immigrants from the West Indies tended to have stronger job prospects. Historians have offered several explanations for this, ranging from these immigrants having usually had better access to education in their home countries than those who had lived under slavery or the very recent aftermath of slavery, as well as prejudice against Southern Black migrants, which native-born Black New Yorkers were also often accused of exacerbating. We can see, for example, that while most tenants from the South held positions such as laundress, day laborer, or cook, i.e. jobs that were either manual or service in nature, the West Indian tenants held positions such as butler or sailor, which were a little bit higher status. We can look at the Martin family from the Danish West Indies. Their head of household was a woman named Alice, a 39-year-old widow who worked as a laundress and lived with her 4 children, 20-year-old Albertina, 18-year-old Alexander, 16-year-old Lillian, and 15-year-old Patrick. Alexander was a stationary engineer, so something that requires quite a bit of skill and training, and Patrick was listed as attending school. In New York State, school attendance was only mandatory until age 14, so the fact that Patrick was still attending and presumably not working implies that the family must not have been too hard up for money, or at least had chosen to forego extra income for his education. Both Lillian and Albertina were recorded as being occupied in housework, meaning that they were not employed outside the home. While the Martin family, who arrived in the US in 1892, were far from well off, they likely had a bit more stability than some of their neighbors. As residents moved into the neighborhood, they established their own businesses and institutions. One of the first was Union Baptist Church, originally at 202 West 63rd Street. Union Baptist was established in 1898 by Reverend George Sims. Sims was born in Virginia to formerly enslaved parents. He moved north and, very improbably, earned an engineering degree while he worked as an elevator operator. He first founded Union Baptist in rented storefronts, gradually raising the money to construct a dedicated building. In 1901, this was finally achieved, and this building here at 202 West 63rd Street was built. Originally, it was only 3 stories. That 4th story here was added. You might think that this really does not look like what you expect a church to look like, and that was essentially intentional. Sims envisioned this space as facilitating Baptist worship, but more importantly, serving as a center for social service for fellow Black migrants from the South. In New York at the turn of the century, very few options existed to help such newcomers to the city, and even fewer were Black-run. There were a few in the Tenderloin, but those too had been massively impacted by both racial violence, police brutality, and the construction of Penn Station. It isn't entirely clear exactly which services Union Baptist offered in this building at first, but they were probably a mix of childcare, an employment agency, and adult classes. These would have been pretty standard initiatives. The space was likely designed to be multi-purpose with movable walls so that the rooms could be adapted depending on changing needs. By 1904, the church had also raised enough funds to purchase the lots beside their building at 204 to 206 West 63rd Street. Ambitiously, they hired architect James Riley Gordon, better known today for his Texas courthouse buildings, if you happen to know your Texas courthouse buildings, to design this dedicated church building. This building, which was rather large, was masonry construction and essentially resembled what we expect a church building to look like. I do particularly like the architect's elevation drawings because they emphasize the slope of the streets in San Juan Hill, which were a notorious feature of the neighborhood's landscape. This steep incline was a constant source of worry for parents who feared their children would hurt themselves playing in the streets because of it. It also was a factor in the poor quality of housing in the area. It's kind of hard to build on slopes. It also relates to some theories as to how the neighborhood got the name San Juan Hill, though that's debatable. More often, contemporary sources claim that the name alluded to the dangerous nature of the area, as if it were akin to the danger of the Battle of San Juan Hill from the Spanish-American War, but many theories abound. With this new church building, Union Baptist was able to give over their building at 202 West 63rd Street for charitable and reform work. In 1895, Union Baptist partnered, 1898, Union Baptist partnered with an organization called the New York Free Kindergarten Association for Colored Children, who had previously operated out of a rented storefront and before that, a row house. This childcare organization was run by both Black and white women who wanted to forge an interracial institution dedicated to children's welfare, regardless of race. The kindergarten served children 5 years old and younger, which I realize isn't really what we consider ages for kindergarten today, but this was very much a developing idea in the realm of childcare at the time. They did offer afternoon classes for older childhood education, and they did offer afternoon classes for older children, though. If a mother were to place her child in the care of the kindergarten, she'd be expected to bring them to the building's reception room located on the 2nd floor by 7 a.m., washed, fed, and dressed. These emerging kindergartens, there were many throughout the city, but they were almost always for white children, were controversial. It was argued that they essentially facilitated mothers' abilities to work outside the home away from their children. Well, of course, today it isn't really shocking. This was sort of a new territory for reformers, who generally came from the middle or even upper class, and were often ignorant of the choices working poor mothers had to make. So the creation of this childcare institution in San Juan Hill, where many mothers had no choice but to work long, labor-intensive day jobs, such as laundresses or domestic servants, must have been a huge lifeline for a lot of families. Eventually, in around 1914, the institution caught the attention of the city's more well-financed and influential charitable organizations, namely the white-run Henry Street settlement on the Lower East Side. The Henry Street settlement took over the building, rebranded it as Lincoln House, and added an additional story, that fourth story we see here. This new story included a small roof garden where the children could play during the warmer months. The care of infants by the Lincoln House was much publicized and a significant component of fundraising. Photos in newspapers and pamphlets celebrated their annual baby shows. You can see one photo here. Further, the nursery was the only one in the city for Black children that received an endowment. Unfortunately, and quite puzzlingly, the white reformers of Lincoln House chose to close the nursery soon after it opened, arguing that it incentivized new mothers to leave their very young infants in the care of strangers. Lincoln House also upped their daily rates for other child care programs, which forced many families to go without. The institution only lasted a few years after closing by 1918. Lincoln House was not the only was not the only endeavor the Henry Street settlement embarked on in San Juan Hill. In around 1905, a woman named Elizabeth Tyler approached the institution's founder, Lillian Wald, to persuade her to support the creation of a branch in the neighborhood focused on healthcare. Tyler was the first Black visiting nurse employed by the Henry Street settlement. After being confronted with the disappointing reality that Black patients did not seek the services of the white-run settlement house, primarily because its branches weren't located in neighborhoods with Black residents, Tyler sought out the janitors of tenements in San Juan Hill and asked whether they were aware of sick tenants in their buildings. One report recorded that in San Juan Hill, 314 out of every 1,000 babies would die within the first year, compared to, for example, 73 babies out of 1,000 on the Lower East Side. Startled too by the staggering infant mortality rate, Tyler realized that the scope of her work was far larger than one nurse could accomplish, so fellow nurse Edith Carter was hired to assist. The two established relationships with neighborhood churches and doctors as they sought to find sick residents. Through persistence, Tyler and Carter made a convincing case to Wald to fund the rental of a storefront in San Juan Hill in 1906 called Stillman House. The organization briefly operated out of several different locations, but ultimately settled at 205 West 60th Street. The organization was headed by Black reformer Ida A. Morgan, who lived in one of the neighborhood's model tenements. The new branch subdivided the ground floor to accommodate 4 rooms, each of which was multi-purpose. The front room, which was the largest, was used as an assembly room, a classroom, and a gymnasium. Another room was used for classes in carpentry and sewing, and the other 2 rooms rotated use between a kitchen, dining room storage, and additional classrooms. A photograph of Stillman House shows that the backyard was adapted as a playground. Children are shown using a swing set and teeter-totter, while younger children sit together playing card games. A woman reformer acting as a playground monitor stands toward the back, surveying the activities. This arrangement, however, was not ideal for the aims of the branch. Although children and children's health were central to their purpose, the intention was for the spaces on West 60th Street to serve the medical needs of adults and children alike. This is what partly inspired the Henry Street settlement to acquire their spaces at 202 West 63rd Street and move childcare work over there. Black-owned businesses also began to thrive in San Juan Hill. One notable but a bit unusual such enterprise were funeral homes. One example was the Dillard and Brown Funeral Parlor located at 209 West 62nd Street. In either 1908 or 1909, the ground floor commercial space of the mixed-use tenement building became home to the licensed undertakers and embalmers. This was not the business's first home, however. Previously, this business had been on the ground floor of the commercial space at 202 West 63rd Street, while the building was still owned by Union Baptist Church. In 1908, when the Henry Street settlement took over control of the building and converted the ground floor space into the use by their own institution, the undertaker business moved to the location on West 62nd Street. The owners, Allen Dillard and John H. Dillard, were both Black men who had migrated from the South in search of better prospects. Dillard began his professional life as a driver, but in 1901 entered the undertaking business. He lived at 86 Putnam Street in Brooklyn with his 7 children and wife, and they owned their own home, which was certainly a big achievement. It was common for middle-class Black residents to live in Brooklyn and commute the long journey into the city for work, usually by steamship. John H. Dillard was an undertaker as well and was married to a woman named Florence H. Brown. Florence and John were married in Virginia in 1901 before moving to New York City, where John supported Florence while she attended mortuary school. It's unclear whether John actually had any experience with undertaking or embalming. His only listed occupations include insurance and livery work, but he was somehow involved in the business nonetheless. In the late 19th century, it was increasingly common for funeral homes to employ women embalmers. This was largely due to standards of decency. It was considered inappropriate for a male embalmer to handle the inevitably naked body of a woman. Historians have also noted that some African cultures privilege women in death and burial practices, and this tradition was carried on by many enslaved people in the South. Embalming was also a relatively new field. The practice and techniques were greatly advanced during the Civil War, as families of fallen soldiers were desperate to see their loved ones one last time, as well as to ensure that the body was properly identified. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Black mortuary and funeral workers held a special place of importance in Black communities and neighborhoods, one of the reasons we see so many in places like San Juan Hill and Harlem. Few white undertakers or embalmers would do business with Black clients, and even finding cemeteries that would inter their bodies could be difficult. Given the spiritual, emotional, and moral significance of death and burial, Black funeral workers were particularly valued for their services. As well, Black funeral directors were often unique in that they existed independently of other invariably white financial networks and thus represented a model for Black entrepreneurship. Given the respected place of funeral workers, they sometimes intervened in community matters and advocated for fellow Black New Yorkers. In 1922, for example, a man named Claudius Springer, who lived close to Dillard in Brooklyn, died unexpectedly, leaving his 5 children and pregnant wife destitute. Springer's body was initially and unceremoniously buried in a potter's field before Dillard found the body and organized to raise funds for a new burial and support for Springer's widow. Dillard and Brown's business practices were also innovative and meant to accommodate the financial strains faced by clients, many of whom were San Juan Hill residents, who likely had little funds to expend on funeral services. Pioneered by Dillard, the business had a policy of never burying the deceased in a casket, except in the case of infants. This was meant to save clients money and discourage predatory funeral practices. Possibly questionable today, but certainly a benevolent gesture. Personal scandals mired the business, and Dillard and Brown's location on West 62nd Street was short-lived. Sometime around 1917, Florence began an affair with a man in New Jersey. Upon discovering this, her husband John filed for divorce. Florence changed her last name to Brown with an E. She simply tacked on an E, and opened her own undertaking business at 436 Lenox Avenue. She claimed to be the first Black embalmer in Harlem. And interestingly, her business lasted at the same location until 2017. San Juan Hill is also where a number of Black businessmen began to enter the real estate game. For example, George Sims of Union Baptist. In 1906, Sims launched the Sims Union Realty Company in the hopes that the venture could serve as both a solution to the church's debts as well as provide a Black-run alternative for tenants. For $5, Union Baptist congregants could purchase 1 share in the company. That same year, the Sims Union Realty Company purchased 4 old law tenement buildings on West 64th Street and 2 on West 61st Street. All of these tenement buildings followed dumbbell plans, but included 3-room arrangements and were newly decorated by the company. As with the white-run tenements, the Sims Union Realty Company rented to, quote, respectable people only. Seemingly, this venture wasn't particularly successful because mentions of it in the press ceased a few years after it began operating. Philip A. Payton Jr., arguably Harlem's most famous real estate pioneer, also established his work in San Juan Hill. To those unfamiliar, Payton is remembered as having fundamentally reshaped the housing landscape of early 20th century New York City. Often called the father of Harlem, Payton recognized that racial segregation in housing, though discriminatory and unjust, had created a distinct market opportunity. Excluded from many neighborhoods, Black New Yorkers faced severe barriers in renting quality apartments. Payton turned his exclusion into the basis for a bold business strategy. In 1904, he founded the Afro-American Realty Company, backed by Black investors who saw both profit and racial uplift in property ownership. The company purchased and leased apartment buildings in Harlem and rented them to Black tenants, often on blocks previously restricted to white residents. In 1905, during what newspapers dubbed a, quote, real estate race war, Payton countered white landlords who sought to expel Black tenants by acquiring nearby buildings and relocating displaced families. Through strategic acquisitions and assertive management, he accelerated Harlem's transformation into a center of Black residential life. In 1908, however, the Afro-American Realty Company was dissolved, and Payton then founded the Philip A. Payton Jr. Company. In 1911, newspaper ads showed that a building at 152 West 62nd Street was managed by the Philip A. Payton Jr. Company, demonstrating his shared interest in the neighborhoods of Harlem and San Juan Hill. This ad shows that for this address, the rent was $20 and $21 a month, depending on the layout you choose. In 2026, this is about $660. This was on the higher end of standard pricing for comparable apartments. The building, which was developed alongside the three buildings beside it, was built in 1899 by architect Frederick Charles Zobel, who also owned it. Zobel designed many tenements and commercial structures throughout Manhattan. White developers and architects took a specific interest in building low-income housing in San Juan Hills for San Juan Hills residents. One example was the Phipps Model Tenements, number 2, also just called Phipps Houses number 2. Built in 1906, Phipps Houses number 2 was the second of 4 structures called model tenements built for Black tenants in San Juan Hill, and ultimately the most well-known. These 4 were called the Tuskegee Model Tenement, which was built first, the Hampton Model Tenement, Phipps Houses number 2, and then Phipps Houses number 3. Out of these 4, Phipps Houses number 2 and Phipps Houses number 3, sited on lots directly behind Phipps Houses number 2 on West 64th Street, are the only 2 that were not destroyed and redeveloped in the 1930s for NYCHA's Amsterdam houses. Originally, this structure consisted of 164 apartments with 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom, and 4-bedroom options. In keeping with modern standards, as well as increasingly strict housing legislation, the building was fireproofed and equipped with steam heat, hot water, and private bathrooms. Model tenements were large housing blocks that became particularly prominent after the 1901 new law, which both opened up avenues for architects to experiment with design and made it so that tenements needed to span multiple lots to accommodate new regulations. These structures were generally funded by philanthropists with the intention of improving the conditions of poverty in the city while still turning a modest profit. Usually, these buildings would see a 3 to 5% return on investment each year. Throughout Manhattan and Brooklyn, model tenements were built almost always with the purpose of housing white European immigrants. Phipps Houses number 2 was built following the success of Phipps Houses number 1, which was built on East 31st Street by architect Grosvenor Atterbury and hailed as an architectural marvel. These structures incorporated the latest innovations and legislation regarding housing design, which included large central courtyards for better lighting, air circulation, and fire prevention, as well as units better designed around accommodating the nuclear family. These model tenements were the result of complex motivations. While many reformers were sincere in their desires to assist Manhattan's Black poor, many also saw a financial opportunity and a means to control the ways in which Black residents lived. Ultimately, model tenements were criticized for still being too inaccessible for the poorest of the poor. Like criticisms later leveled against NYCHA, these housing developments were more geared towards those who were already a little upwardly mobile and gradually became populated by the middle class. It's truly remarkable and honestly a bit puzzling that white philanthropists and reformers decided to turn their attention to San Juan Hill and build model tenements in the neighborhood. The philanthropist behind Phipps Houses number 2 and 3 was Henry Phipps Jr., a business partner of Andrew Carnegie. Phipps was persuaded to construct housing in San Juan Hill for Black tenants by Mary Ovington White and John E. Milholland, both white activists who would later be instrumental in the founding of the NAACP in 1915. Ovington, who had been active in the settlement house movement in Manhattan and Brooklyn, pushed for the inclusion of spaces for reform work within Phipps Houses number 2, while Milholland, a wealthy businessman who had made his fortune in pneumatic tubes, provided sound financial advice. Ovington sought to incorporate the spirit of settlement houses into the improved and updated architectural space of model tenements. Rather than occupy a Victorian mansion in the vein of a big boarding house, as she called it, Ovington proposed to, quote, get a model tenement built in one of the crowded Negro quarters, preferably the 60s, and to have a room in it for settlement, end quote. W.E.B. Du Bois, whom Ovington was in regular contact with regarding these plans, had publicly pitched this concept at a conference in 1903 held at Mount Olivet Baptist Church, which was then on 53rd Street, but of course now is in Harlem. Du Bois envisioned this work as a partnership between white and Black reformers, wherein white reformers could help guide Black migrants through the inner workings of Northern urban life. It came as a bitter disappointment for Ovington when the plans for Phipps Houses number 2 were ultimately sparser and more austere than those of Phipps Houses number 1. While Atterbury had, by 1906, already begun to make a name for himself in housing design, as well he had designed Phipps's mansion on East 87th Street, the architects attached to Phipps Houses number 2, their names were Whitfield and King, were primarily commissioned to design Carnegie's libraries. Henry Davis Whitfield was also the brother-in-law of Carnegie, which is possibly how Phipps came to employ him in his San Juan Hill model tenements. In a letter written to Du Bois in December of 1905, Ovington communicated that the designs for the model tenement had been finalized and that the plans for Phipps Houses number 1 had far outpaced those for Phipps Houses number 2, and what a shame it was. And we can see here that plans are available, and there was space given over for Ovington for her reform work. And Phipps Houses number 2 was certainly no shanty or dilapidated tenement. Ovington's vision for the model tenement as a place wherein the boundaries between social and private life were porous and reformers lived side by side with those they assisted was influential in the planning and use of the model tenement. Ovington proposed that the two white women reformers live together in one of the building's units, and two Black women reformers share another, with the rest of the building still reserved for Black tenants. Many of Ovington's proposals were shaped by interracial reform strategies already active in San Juan Hill, including the New York Free Kindergarten Association for Colored Children. In dialogue and partnership with this association, Ovington liaised with the model tenements planners to have the apartment units on the ground floor reserved for kindergarten activities and cooking instruction, as well as use of a child care room in the basement, as you can see here in red. Ovington herself rented one of the reserved apartments for 8 months. She frequently publicized herself as the only white person to live in the San Juan Hill model tenements, although this wasn't really true. In the 1910 census, it indicates that several white women actually lived with their Black husbands in the building, such as this family here. 30-year-old English woman Mary lived with her husband George, a Black man from Oklahoma, along with their 2 daughters. While a central figure in efforts to promote racial progress, Ovington was strategic in her self-promotion and likely downplayed the significance of Black organizations and figures to housing reform in San Juan Hill. Phipps Houses number 2 remained an important fixture of San Juan Hill for decades. Musician Thelonious Monk lived in one of the building's 3-room apartments as a child. At various times, tenants lobbied for better conditions and housing standards equal to the city's white tenants. For example, in 1917, during a particularly cold winter, tenants at the 4 San Juan Hill model tenements were denied heat, while the white tenants at Phipps Houses number 1 were not. Black tenants, with the help of Union Baptist Church Reverend George Sims, organized to pressure the tenement's owners, the City and Suburban Homes Company, to issue refunds for heating bills. Though the neighboring model tenements, the Tuskegee and the Hampton, were destroyed in the 1930s to make way for Amsterdam houses, Phipps House number 2 and number 3 were sold in 1961 to private corporations to be used as conventional rental apartments, which still stand today. And if you are curious, you can go find them and look at the prices for the current available apartments. Phipps Houses number 2 was full of tenants from all over the country and world, such as Barbados, St. Kitts, British Guiana, Trinidad, and many more. Beyond Black residents of San Juan Hill, we can examine residents from other backgrounds that call the neighborhood home. For example, if we look closely at the history of just one building, 244 West 61st Street, we can see a whole story of immigration in the area. The building was designed by architects Webster and Thompson. This firm designed tenements throughout the city, particularly on the Upper East and West sides. The building was financed by John B. Smith, who also funded the development of the neighboring buildings from 238 to 242 West 61st Street. Not much information is available on Smith, though he did live on the Upper East Side and was a patron of the Jewish Theological Seminary and the Hebrew Orphan Asylum, so suggesting that he himself was likely Jewish. The building was designed under the Tenement House Act of 1879, meaning the air shafts were relatively small and the maximum lot space and the building was allowed to take up was rather large. So the building was probably not quite as enjoyable to live in as tenements soon to be built, particularly after 1901. In 1900, 11 households occupied the tenement. Buildings constructed under the 1870 guidelines usually had 4 units per floor, meaning that the 5-story building probably had 20 units in all. All of these tenants in 1900 were Black. Most had migrated from the southern states, though a few had immigrated from the West Indies. One tenant at 244 West 61st Street, however, presents a bit of a mystery. Her name was listed as Minnie Mitchell, age 26 and widowed, and she was listed as Black but born in Asia, as were her parents. Her occupation was trained nurse, though no other substantial information was given. It is unclear what this means. In the 1900 census, Chinese, Indian, and Japanese people were the most common Asian nationalities in the United States, and they were labeled as such in the census. Asia was not really a category that census takers were supposed to list, so it's questionable as to why she was marked as that. Certainly, there were Asian residents in the area. The stretch of West 65th Street between Amsterdam and Columbus Avenues was known as a sort of Little Tokyo, with a small concentration of Japanese residents in the early 20th century. At 146 West 65th Street was the Ichikari boarding house, and next door at 148 West 65th Street was the Taiyo boarding house, 2 establishments that primarily served Issei, or Japanese immigrants, and Nisei, American citizens born of Issei. American citizens who were children of Issei. Unlike Chinese immigration, Japanese immigration to the US was unrestricted in the late 19th century and into the early 20th century, with 30,000 arriving in 1907 alone. Most, however, settled on the West Coast. Because of certain restrictions, the vast majority of those who immigrated were men. This made the establishment of boarding houses particularly necessary. Boarding houses usually offered certain services that women of the house typically provided, such as meals or laundry. In the early 1930s, the Taiyo boarding house's owner converted the street-level space into a restaurant called the Taiyo Sukiyaki Restaurant. This restaurant was popular with Japanese manual laborers, particularly because it served as a front for an illegal gambling operation. At 144 West 65th Street was the Japan Products Company. It was owned by Dr. Kuro Murase, a former ophthalmologist who had previously had a practice in Rose Hill. The store sold Japanese groceries and produce, as well as other goods from Japan. Sadly, Japan's involvement in World War II had deep impacts on San Juan Hill's Japanese community. Murase was forced by the FBI to close his business and relocate. So returning to Minnie Mitchell at 244 West 61st Street, if she was indeed from Asia, there was a community nearby that she might have found some kinship with. If we continue to look at the story of the building, we see that in 1910, 2 white families, one of whom was Jewish, shared the building with a number of Black tenants, which was, as I've stated previously, a pretty rare occurrence, even still in 1910. By 1930, the building was entirely rented by Black tenants, with the surprising addition of one tenant named Fritz Bowman from West Africa, along with his wife Matilda from the British West Indies. Their two sons and Matilda's daughter from a previous relationship as well. Fritz had arrived in the United States in 1915, a very rare time for Africans to immigrate to the country. Significant immigration from Africa did not begin until the end of the 20th century. Fritz did not have a profession listed, though his wife worked as a janitor for an apartment building. The family lived alongside 11 other Black families in the building, mostly from the British West Indies, New York, and the South. This pattern of unusual tenant backgrounds continued in 1940. A 56-year-old widower named Kareem Bucks from India is listed as living with his 8-year-old daughter, Vivian, along with 18 other Black households in the building. Kareem worked as a waiter and is listed as Black, which might have been either a mistake or confusion on the part of the census taker. While there is a long history of Indian immigration to New York, particularly in regards to Bengali immigrants marrying into Black communities, immigration from India was greatly impacted by the 1924 Immigration Act. This legislation, which built off of the Chinese Exclusion Act from 1882 and the 1917 Immigration Act, which barred immigrants from Asia. However, according to Kareem's World War I draft card, he came to the US via Great Britain. Also, according to this card, he was a machine engineer at the Vanderbilt Hotel. His mother was a woman named Cato Bucks, who lived in Hong Kong, which was at the time a British colony. Just a couple years after the census was taken, Kareem registered for the World War II draft in 1942. In this, he curiously listed his place of birth as Hong Kong, which tracks with his mother's location. And this, interestingly, was confirmed too by his daughter Vivian's marriage announcement in the New York Times much later. Kareem died in 1971 at the age of 87 in New York City. So much of his life still is a mystery as to whether he was Indian or whether he was from Hong Kong or what exactly his background was. In 1950, the last available census, a 40-year-old Chinese man, whose name is unfortunately illegible, lived as a lodger with a 49-year-old Black woman and her 28-year-old son. This Chinese man worked as a noodle manufacturer. All other tenants of the building were also Black. 244 West 61st Street escaped demolition during the Lincoln Square Renewal Project and, in a sense, still exists. The building was joined with 242 West 61st Street and has been extensively renovated, but it still stands today, which is rather rare. San Juan Hill captured the attention and fascination of artists, particularly artists associated with the Ashcan School. The Ashcan School was a loose group of American realist painters active in the early 20th century, especially in New York City. Emerging around 1900 to 1915, the artists rejected academic idealism and genteel subjects in favor of gritty, everyday scenes of urban life. They depicted crowded streets, immigrant groups, tenements, boxing matches, bars, and working-class neighborhoods. Influenced by journalism and urban reform movements, their work emphasized immediacy and social observation rather than moralizing. The name Ashcan, which was originally used pejoratively, referred to their focus on the city's rougher, less polished aspects. Ashcan artists were drawn to the inhabitants and built environment of San Juan Hill, as well as the area's lower rents. This is where, from his top floor studio on West 65th Street, artist George Bellows painted the interracial boxing matches at Tom Sharkey's athletic club just across the street. In 1906, Bellows moved, along with his studio, into the Lincoln Arcade building on Broadway between West 65th and 66th Streets. The building itself embodied many of the features we associate with urban life, features that appear again and again in the work of Ashcan painters. The Lincoln Arcade was constructed as a speculative venture, built in anticipation of white-owned businesses and white residents moving into and reshaping the neighborhood. Architecturally and economically, it signaled a shift in who the area was being designed for. Physically, the arcade linked Broadway to one of the district's major entertainment venues, the Lincoln Square Theater, reinforcing the area's identity as a center of leisure and spectacle. By 1915, the neighborhood around the Lincoln Arcade was being described as, quote, unquestionably a strong amusement center. Property values reflected that transformation. Real estate in the area commanded some of the highest prices in the city for speculative development, underscoring how culture, commerce, and racialized urban change were deeply intertwined. Artist Robert Henry also moved his studio into the building and opened the Henry School of Art there in 1909. A rather strange building, this massive mixed-use six-story structure became home to many struggling artists and writers over the years, including Marcel Duchamp, Thomas Hart Benton, Eugene O'Neill, and Stuart Davis, and a number of others. There, Bellows produced many of his works that most carefully meditated on the dramatic urban change that he witnessed. Like the Tenderloin, the dense mix of housing and small businesses in San Juan Hill created rich ground for artistic experimentation. It gave white artists such as Bellows access to vibrant street life, which they could observe and translate into their work. But for many of them, this proximity was temporary and fleeting. Only 3 years after settling in San Juan Hill, Bellows bought his first home, a three-story house on East 19th Street. In that new setting, the only Black person he likely encountered on a regular basis was his domestic servant, a 19-year-old Jamaican immigrant named Hilda. White artists moved through predominantly Black neighborhoods like San Juan Hill, knowing they could leave when it suited them. Black residents, regardless of class or ambition, did not have that same freedom. While the commercial growth around Lincoln Arcade brought new amenities for white patrons, it also intensified patterns of segregation in San Juan Hill. In 1912, Black sociologist and National Urban League co-founder George Edmund Haynes mapped the neighborhood, visually documenting the concentration of Black residents between West 60th and West 64th Streets, from West End to Amsterdam Avenue. His map makes clear just how sharply divided this landscape had become. The Lincoln Arcade itself had no Black tenants, yet artists like George Bellows and Robert Henry would not have had to walk far to encounter a very different demographic reality. A short walk west or south brought them into blocks of tenements occupied entirely by Black residents. On West 64th, 63rd, and 62nd Street, they would have walked past model tenements for Black tenants, Black missions and churches, schools primarily for Black children, businesses such as Dillard and Brown Funeral Home, and so many more. As white commercial development expanded eastward to serve modern entertainment culture, Black New Yorkers were simultaneously building the institutions necessary to secure stability, support, and community in Manhattan. In 1907, the year he moved into the Lincoln Arcade, Bellows produced a sketch titled Tin Can Battle San Juan Hill. As a note, I'm not going to say the original title, but I do think it's very important to mention that it included the N-word, which I think reveals quite a bit about Bellows's attitudes towards his subject as well as San Juan Hill. It later got changed, I think, by editors, or it's kind of a mystery. But he later published the sketch as a cartoon in Harper's Weekly. In this image, we get a pretty clear distillation of white prejudices towards the neighborhood. It places dramatic emphasis on the bodies of children in the foreground. Their limbs are exaggerated, they twist, lunge, and collide in charged, almost violent motion. Behind them, residents spill out of aging tenements, gathering on stoops and sidewalks to watch. You can even see that there is a for rent sign if you look closely in one of the windows, implying that even more tenements will be crammed in. The crowd feels dense, it feels compressed. The image echoes a line from Mary Ovington White, where she described the area's tenements as, quote, human hives honeycombed with little rooms thicked with human beings, end quote. And importantly, the adults don't intervene, right? They just watch on as the children fight. They look casual, standing with arms crossed, and some look like they're chatting. That detail suggests that what we're witnessing is not an exceptional event, but part of a daily life as Bellows chose to frame it. Perhaps Bellows witnessed such a scene himself while walking the streets of San Juan Hill, but he could very easily have invented the scenario. Newspapers and magazines frequently included stories of similar scenes unfolding in the neighborhood, likely sensationalized for their white readers. We can even look at how the popular press caricatured the neighborhood and see similarities with Bellows's drawing. These images are examples of especially vicious caricatures of Black residents of San Juan Hill, published in the New York Sun. They reduced people in the neighborhood to crude stereotypes, portraying them primarily as gamblers and sex workers, and in doing so, reinforced degrading racial narratives. Like the Bellows, they also suggest that residents are sort of just hanging around all day, i.e. they are not gainfully employed. Bellows was an avid consumer of visual print media and likely aware of how San Juan Hill was routinely depicted. Artists like him perpetuated these broad, uncritical generalizations about San Juan Hill without mention of residents' continual and substantial efforts to mitigate issues like poverty and crime, or improve housing and promote childcare options, or establish their own prosperous businesses. By the mid-20th century, San Juan Hill, long stigmatized in the public imagination as blighted and obsolete, became a prime target for large-scale redevelopment, chiefly helmed by Robert Moses. City officials and planners framed the neighborhood as deteriorated and incompatible with modern urban life, despite the dense social networks, churches, schools, and mutual aid organizations that sustained its residents. Under the promise of urban renewal, thousands were moved from their homes and displaced largely to Harlem in the 1950s and early 1960s to clear the site for what would become Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts. Promoted as a beacon of high culture and civic progress, Lincoln Center symbolized a new vision of Manhattan, orderly, monumental, and oriented toward elite cultural consumption. Some of San Juan Hill's institutions relocated to Harlem, such as Union Baptist Church, which still worships today, or joined with other organizations to continue their work, which was the case of many of the childcare reform centers, such as Lincoln House. Several of the model tenement sites were redeveloped in partnership with their original architect to become NYCHA's Amsterdam houses. Today, few buildings from the neighborhood remain standing. The destruction of San Juan Hill was not simply a byproduct of modernization. It was a deliberate reshaping of urban space that privileged certain publics while rendering others expendable. Thank you. I will end there.
Thank you, Jesse. Much appreciated. Every time I hear you speak, I'm learning more things. Even some of these stories that you've shared with us in the past and we've read, you're adding added depth. So I appreciate that. Claudette, did you want to say anything or?
Just thank you, Jesse. And the Q&A is open for anyone who has questions.
It is. And I'm putting our link to San Juan Hill and some of Jesse's stories, which are included in our map, in the chat. And we do have two questions already. Do you want to take them, Claudette?
Hi, Wayne. Wayne, two questions from Wayne. Thank you for providing this history of San Juan Hill. A recent exhibit of San Juan Hill only addresses the period of time when the area was being destroyed to build Lincoln Center. Please elaborate on why the area was called San Juan Hill.
So there are competing theories on why it's called San Juan Hill. I don't think there's an established narrative. I think the most persuasive that I've seen most often reiterated in contemporary publications is that the violence of the neighborhood was likened to the violence of the Battle of San Juan Hill during the Spanish-American War. I've also heard theories that it has to do with the fact that it is on a hill and it is on this slope. I think those are, I guess, the two most compelling. There are some theories floating around that it has to do with the later Latin American influence, which I don't think is really true. You see that story circulated, but I don't think there's much credibility to that because when the name San Juan Hill gets started and the neighborhood dubbed that, it's long before say Puerto Rican inhabitants were moving into the neighborhood in large numbers. So I think in my opinion, the most credible answer is that it has to do with the Spanish-American War battle. But no one truly knows, unfortunately.
Just a side note, if for anyone who has ever seen West Side Story, the opening credits, if I believe was right, the montage of pictures behind the opening credits is part of what was San Juan Hill?
Yes. Yeah, it's some of the last documentation we have because it was done right. It was filmed right before the demolition.
Another question from Wayne. When did Black residents begin to move from San Juan Hill to Harlem, and did that move represent a move to better residential buildings?
Yeah, so the move more or less starts in around 1915, and a large reason for it had to do with better housing. Harlem was still in development, but there were a lot of pretty good quality single family homes, residential homes, row houses that were still relatively cheap. And there was just more attractive and newer housing in Harlem that was still hadn't entirely been populated by white residents moving in. So it largely did have to do with better housing conditions. In San Juan Hill, while there was new housing, it just wasn't really being repaired and updated, at least in cases that weren't, say, model tenements.
From Timothy Malloy, do you think San Juan Hill was targeted to remove the Black tenants, or was it legitimately a good location for an art center? Robert Moses, that's a interesting thought.
Good question, and certainly other scholars have tackled this at length and better than I can. But I think when we say it's targeted, it targeted Black residents. I think a better explanation is that Black residents were seen as expendable in San Juan Hill in a way that white residents were. I don't think there was that there was an impetus to remove slums and slum clearance and get rid of this area of the city that was regarded as blighted and just kind of out of control and run down and essentially unrecoverable. Uh, and so it was just considered, I think, expendable. And that was certainly linked to the fact that it was primarily populated by Black and Puerto Rican residents. I don't think, though, that the reasoning was specifically to remove Black people from their neighborhood. It was just considered they were an afterthought in a sense. It was more they were more expendable than, say, a predominantly white area would have been.
From Charmaine Cave Deschamps, will the recording of this and other presentations in the series be available for watching? Yes, they are, and this will be. It's the recordings are on Save Harlem Now's YouTube channel under the playlist The Road to Harlem. So the previous three programs are already available, and this one should be available hopefully by late afternoon tomorrow. We will send out an email with the link, which will give you access to not just this, but all of the programs in this series. So from Irma Clayton, my parents my Caribbean immigrant grandparents settled in San Juan Hill in 1918. They were members of St. Crispian Church. Please tell what you know about St. Crispian, Cyprian, I'm sorry, and
Yes.
later St. Martin Church in Harlem.
That is wonderful. I have written extensively on St. Cyprian's. I almost included it here, but I've included them in all of my past presentations for Landmark West, so I decided to forego it this time, and now I really wish I had included them. I know a lot about St. Cyprian's, and you are certainly, if you would like to get in touch with me, I'm sure we can provide my contact information. But St. Cyprian's was founded in 1905 in San Juan Hill, and they had a purpose-built building for their church, which they also, similar to Union Baptist, expanded to be so much more than that. They had a childcare center. They had a center for mother's health. They had a milk depot, which was a thing in the early 20th century, where essentially mothers could come and get either fresh milk, or they could get essentially like a proto version of formula. Yes, I could speak at length about St. Cyprian's and also the architecture of their building. They also briefly were home to the first Black women's YWCA in the city too, which is really fascinating. And yes, they actually, interestingly, during under Robert Moses, when residents of San Juan Hill were being evicted and sent to other locations by the city, St. Cyprian's building was actually turned into headquarters for these relocation offices where tenants would go and essentially file their paperwork to find housing for their removal.
John, could you take that one? The next one I would tickle.
Surely I can.
Thank
Uh,
you.
no problem. Susan asks, or states, Lincoln Center has a large San Juan Hill sign emblazoned on the side of one building. Does Lincoln Center in any way or place acknowledge and share, such as in printed materials or a museum display, information on the San Juan Hill neighborhood, or is only a large sign as a minimal gesture?
So I have not actually been to the building of Lincoln Square or Lincoln Center in a while, so maybe Sean or someone else has an answer as to what's actually going on in the building. But I will say their website has they've launched sort of a digital initiative that is intended to preserve some of the histories related to San Juan Hill. I've worked with them a bit on it. But a lot of what they are doing is more geared towards the artistic and music history of San Juan Hill, and less the sort of social history, architectural history that Landmark West has really pioneered.
That's right. They have a website called The Legacies of San Juan Hill. And there's a lot of content and a lot of different researchers involved in that.
Mhm.
The next question from Eric Washington. Jesse, did your research turn up Bertie H. Haynes, protege of Lillian Ward and sister of George E. Haynes, who headed Lincoln House?
Yes, I have also written a lot on Bertie Haynes in my dissertation. Yes, she, brother of George Haynes, who I mentioned earlier, he is the one who created that map of San Juan Hill. His sister was a wonderful reformer who primarily worked with childcare institutions like Lincoln House. The short condensed version of that is that Bertie Haynes was seemingly a really successful reformer, and she gets brought on when Lincoln House. It's when the Henry Street settlement takes over the building and becomes Lincoln House. And it seems as though, despite the fact that she seemingly was very successful and really well loved by the community, the white reformers at Henry Street settlement kind of railroaded her out of the job. And after she is sort of kind of pushed out, the institution closes very shortly after. I haven't been able to figure out exactly what went on. I can't find any records that really exactly spell out what happened to cause this downfall. But it very much seems like Lincoln House's ultimate closure had to do with the fact that this really beloved reformer who had done such great work for the organization and really kind of led them was really unceremoniously ousted for unclear reasons.
Thank you. Another question, and this might be a little loaded. At the time of Lincoln Center's development, what percentage of the neighborhood was still black? So I guess that would
Wow.
maybe we'd say 1958 when it was declared a slum.
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know a percentage on that. Maybe you know, Sean. My work is a bit earlier than that, so I'm bad with the kind of nitty-gritty details like percentages.
So we could find that from our website
Yeah.
because we did all of the census data, but the last snapshot was 1950, so it would already be 8 years stale.
Hmm.
But we could pull that because that's all of that's
Hmm.
on the website.
Yeah.
Another question. There was a strong mo movement to change the name from San Juan Hill to Columbus Hill. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, sure. So that comes around 1915. A little after 1915 is when I've seen the first mentions of this rebranding as Columbus Hill. And this was certainly something led by reformers. There was an institution there called the Henrietta Industrial School, which had been essentially a school exclusively for Black children. In about, I forget the exact numbers, but something like 1918, it gets transformed into the Columbus Hill Community Center or Health Center, depending on when you're looking at it. And that was really one of the biggest efforts to kind of reshape the neighborhood or rebrand the neighborhood as distance from this really sort of negative or pejorative association with the term San Juan Hill. Lincoln House as well had been really active in trying to say, we want the neighborhood to be called Columbus Hill. We want to be distanced from this association. And I will say, I think the rebrand is sort of successful in a way. You do really see the area get referred, beginning in around 1915, begin to be referred more frequently in the press as Columbus Hill and not San Juan Hill. But again, this is also when people are beginning to leave for Harlem. So the damage is already kind of beginning and people are already leaving. And there's even less impetus to kind of improve the conditions of the neighborhood, unfortunately.
So Irma's asking, where is the Lincoln Center sign for San Juan Hill? I think she's where people are referring to as the Nina Chanel Abney uh, sticker mural. It is on the north side of Geffen Hall on 65th Street, and it's called San Juan Hill, Heal. I think that's what it is, unless there's another sign that you know of, Jesse.
I don't know. No.
And then just going back to the population percentage that was still Black, the question was like more about the pace. And I just think one of the things that I've learned in all of our research was that so much of San Juan Hill, as we saw in Haynes's map too, that was Black, was always west of Amsterdam. And that while it was a dense African American neighborhood, it was never predominantly Black outside of the 1910s and teens.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think his if you look at the census records, his map is like slightly misleading. It looks like there truly is no Black residency in certain areas where there were you can look at the census data, there were, but it's much sparser. As you say, it was kind of confined to between West End and Amsterdam, on West 63rd, 62nd-ish to West 63rd. And so while the area gets kind of like lumped in with San Juan Hill, and even sometimes you see the Tenderloin lumped in with San Juan Hill weirdly, it is far more racially complex than it's often kind of branded as this like exclusively Black neighborhood, which wasn't really true. And I try to emphasize that by talking about George Bellows, who is living in like the sort of white area, but it would have been inconceivable, I think, for him to exist in the neighborhood without encountering Black residents. It would have been very hard for him to walk down the street without being immersed in that as well.
Great. I've just also added another link in the chat to Nina Schnell Abney's piece, San Juan Hill, which was the sign. I don't see any other questions either in the chat or in the Q&A, but I do thank you, Jesse, and I'm going to turn it back to Claudette if she wants to say any final words concluding this journey she's led us on.
You, Jesse and Sean, and thank you to all our preservation partners who have participated in this program, starting with the Merchants House Museum, Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation, Black in Historic Preservation, and Landmark West. As you see the road to Harlem, we see along the way churches and institutions that have followed that road from the financial district up to Harlem, such as Abyssinian Baptist Church. We see Philip Payton coming from San Juan Hill. We saw Mount Olivet, I think, which was also in the Tenderloin, traveling that road as well. So we invite you all to go back and review these series. I am hoping to sort of circle back with our presenters and provide you with a series of books or other links for those of you who want to dive deeper into these communities where there were now you can go onto the Merchants House website and they will have a lot of information about the free and half-free Blacks, particularly the gentleman of Manuel Plaza. The village has a significant amount of information. The village preservation has a significant amount of information. We have shared Professor Kennedy Wyther's studio work for her students with you on our website on our last email we sent to, and there's also a link to it on the YouTube video. And Landmarks West has a complete page dedicated to San Juan Hill, where you can look at the buildings, maps, and a lot more history. So if you have the time or you wish to learn more, there are plenty of opportunities to do so. Our upcoming program, I had mentioned it earlier on the other programs, will be on March 24th. We had originally scheduled for March 30th, but there is going to be a premiere of a documentary film about W.E. Du Bois, and David Leverin Lewis, who is the Pulitzer Prize winning author of two biographies, will be in attendance of that. So we are changing the date for that program at the Schomburg to March 24th, and it is a One Harlem, Two Voices. It's with David Levering Lewis, who, as I said before, has written two biographies about Du Bois. He's also very famous for When Harlem Was in Vogue, and with Victoria Christopher Murray, who has written several books, but the latest one is called Harlem Rhapsody. And it is about the relationship between, it's a historical fiction, and a lot of her research, she used David's books for that. It's about the relationship between Jessie Redmond Fawcett, who Langston Hughes called the midwife of the Harlem Renaissance, as she brought Langston Hughes and Countee Cullen and other Black writers to audiences through the Crisis magazine, which was the magazine for the NAACP. So we look forward to seeing you on the 24th. We'll be sending you out an email about that so you can register for that program. As I said before, Save Harlem Now, with the exception of this program, which was funded by Councilmember Gail Brewer, our funding for programs are done through our membership and donations from people like you. So I look forward to seeing you clicking that QR code and helping to support our continuation of these types of programs about Harlem history, Black history in New York City and in America. Thank you so much and have a great evening.